He was born in the darkness of enslavement, in a place and time where the notion of liberty for a child, such as he was, little more than a whispered dream. His mother named him Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, though the world would come to know him as Frederick Douglass. There is no precise record of his birth date. He later chose to mark February 14th as his birthday, suspecting he entered this world in 1818, near Tuckahoe Creek in Talbot County, Maryland. His mother, Harriet Bailey, was an enslaved woman of courage and quiet defiance. His father was rumored to be a white man, perhaps a member of the family who claimed ownership of Harriet, but Frederick himself never knew with absolute certainty. This mystery of his origin only underscored the harsh truths about slavery's ability to uproot and distort the most fundamental ties of family. He rarely saw his mother. She was assigned to a plantation some miles away, and though she endured punishing labor, she made occasional journeys under the cover of night to spend a few precious moments with her child before she slipped back into the gloom of her forced labor. The memory of her warmth was fleeting. As Frederick would later recall, "I never saw my mother, to know her as such, more than 4 or 5 times in my life, and each of these times was very short in duration." She died when he was still very young, leaving only the faint outline of a face he could scarcely remember. His earliest experiences were shaped by the constants of bondage, hunger, cold, fear, the heartbreak of uncertain relationships, and the ever-looming threat of violence. He would write in his first autobiography, "You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave was made a man." This statement was not simply a reflection on his personal journey, but a challenge to the entire institution that sought to break every spark of individuality in those it subjugated. Indeed, his entire life would become a grand demonstration of how irrepressible the human spirit can be when pitted against systems of brutal injustice. As a boy, he resided at the Wye House plantation in Maryland, owned by Colonel Edward Lloyd. The plantation was large, with many enslaved people spread over substantial tracts of land. Under the authority of a supervisor named Captain Anthony, thought by Frederick to be his first master, he saw the mercilessness with which enslaved persons were treated. Captain Anthony was not the most severe overseer Frederick encountered, but he was a man who believed deeply in the absolute right of masters over their chattel. Frederick witnessed beatings and heard the heart-rending shrieks of those who dared to rebel or simply failed to meet the impossible expectations set upon them. From these early years, the boy learned that it was dangerous to speak freely, dangerous to trust, and even more perilous to hope for better days. Yet hope was an ember that could not be entirely extinguished. He was often hungry, sometimes forced to eat from a common trough like an animal, but he adapted. He survived on scraps as best he could, forging the beginning of a resilience that would grow with him through each stage of his life. "Slavery," he would later write, "does away with fathers as it does away with families." And so, in these grim surroundings, he found small comfort in the companionship of other children, both enslaved and free. He listened to the songs that echoed across the fields, melancholy spirituals that seemed to blend sorrow and hope in equal measure, a testament to the communal strength that could still exist amid the horrors of bondage. Around the age of 7 or 8, an unexpected turn changed the trajectory of his life. He was sent to Baltimore to live with Hugh and Sophia Auld, relatives of his master's family. The reasons behind this move were multifold. Perhaps the household in Baltimore needed a child servant. Perhaps it was an effort to remove Frederick from an environment where he might become difficult to subjugate. No matter the reason, it proved to be a stroke of good fortune for him. Baltimore was a bustling port city, worlds apart from the isolated plantation. Enslaved people there often enjoyed slightly less oppressive conditions, and the interactions with free black people were more common. He found a new environment in which his own curiosity could begin to flourish. Initially, life under Hugh and Sophia Auld seemed almost kind by comparison. Sophia, unaccustomed to the role of mistress over enslaved persons, began to teach Frederick the alphabet. She had, in her innocence, believed she was doing a benevolent thing by showing a bright boy how to read. Frederick reveled in these lessons, grasping the fundamentals of letters and words with astonishing speed. He wrote, "The first step in my enslaved life toward freedom was learning the alphabet." The significance of this moment could not be overstated. For him, acquiring literacy was more than just a practical skill. It was a key to the wider world, a vantage point from which he could perceive not only his own condition, but also the means to challenge it. When Hugh Auld discovered that Sophia was teaching the boy to read, he rebuked her harshly. Auld insisted that teaching an enslaved child to read would render him unfit for slavery. "If you give a nigger an inch, he will take an ell," Auld exclaimed, warning his wife that literacy would make Frederick discontented and unhappy. These words seared themselves into Frederick's mind. "From that moment," he wrote, "I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom." Indeed, the open hostility to black literacy revealed how deeply white slaveholders feared an educated mind. In that instant, Frederick's desire to learn only grew. Though Sophia Auld ceased her formal instruction, her initial kindness had already planted a seed of yearning in him that could not be uprooted. He scoured the city for opportunities to learn, observing street signs, poring over discarded newspapers, making friends with white children in the neighborhood who might share a few letters or words in exchange for crusts of bread. Slowly but surely, he fed his intellect with scraps of knowledge. Baltimore offered him fleeting glimpses of the world beyond the narrow constraints of the plantation. He saw ships coming into harbor from distant places, men moving about freely, the hum of commerce and life swirling around him. He began to absorb the radical notion that he might have a rightful place in that world, if only he could find the means to liberate himself. He devoured newspapers, especially those that contained political speeches or editorials on the subject of abolition. The more he read, the more he understood the scope of slavery's injustice. "I read with a keen appetite," he later recalled, "the discussions of abolitionists and slaveholders. This to me was a rich treasure." Each new word and each new idea strengthened his sense that slavery was a colossal moral wrong, an affront to the very concept of humanity. As he entered adolescence, Frederick was moved back and forth between Baltimore and the Eastern Shore. The death of his original master and the subsequent need to settle property and inheritance meant that Frederick was counted among the goods and chattels in the estate. Like furniture or livestock, he was assigned to different relatives, each controlling his fate with absolute power. In these transitions, he witnessed more of the variety of cruelty that enslavers could exhibit. Some were calculating, others impulsively brutal, but all believed in their entitlement to total control. During one such period, he was placed under the supervision of a man named Edward Covey, whose reputation for breaking rebellious enslaved persons was well known. Covey was cunning, known to hide in the tall grass or behind corners to catch anyone shirking their tasks. He beat Frederick frequently and demanded an exhausting amount of fieldwork that taxed the young man physically and spiritually. Frederick felt his spirit diminishing under Covey's tyrannical rule, remarking, "I was broken in body, soul, and spirit. My natural elasticity was crushed, my intellect languished, the disposition to read departed. The dark night of slavery closed in upon me." Yet in one pivotal moment of defiance, Frederick discovered within himself a new wellspring of dignity. One hot day, when Covey attempted to tie him up for another beating, Frederick resisted. The two wrestled, and Frederick managed to hold Covey off. "You have seen how a man was made a slave," he would later write. "You shall see how a slave was made a man." The fight lasted nearly 2 hours, and though Frederick knew Covey could kill him with impunity, he also realized that Covey feared losing face if he could not subdue this young man. After that day, Covey never laid a hand on Frederick again. Douglass considered this confrontation a turning point in his life, proof that the spirit of resistance could not be crushed, and that physical opposition, even with the risk it carried, could be a catalyst for regaining lost self-respect. "This battle with Mr. Covey," Douglass wrote, "was the turning point in my career as a slave. It rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom and revived within me a sense of my own manhood." Spurred by the fight, he yearned more than ever to escape. He made several abortive attempts to run away or to organize plans with other enslaved companions. Though some of these efforts were discovered, resulting in punishment, he remained resolute that his future was not one of eternal servitude. One of his close shaves with capture taught him the lesson that trust was a fragile commodity in a world where a single betrayal could doom one's bid for freedom. He learned to be circumspect. Eventually, he returned to Baltimore and found work in a shipyard, under conditions that were harsh but provided slightly more autonomy than field labor. He also mingled with free black sailors, gleaning further knowledge on how he might one day travel north. Through careful study of shipping schedules, forging identification papers, and enlisting the help of a free black woman named Anna Murray, whom he had fallen in love with, he constructed a plan to escape. On September 3rd, 1838, disguised in a sailor's uniform and carrying a friend's seaman's protection documents, Frederick boarded a northbound train. Every stop was fraught with danger, for if anyone suspected his papers were forged, his life and freedom would be lost. But fortune favored him. The conductors accepted his borrowed documents, and he made his way toward Philadelphia. From there, he journeyed to New York City, where he tasted freedom for the first time in his life. He wrote, "I have often been asked how I felt when I found myself in a free state. It was a moment of the highest excitement I ever experienced. I felt like one who had escaped a den of hungry lions." The sense of relief, however, was soon replaced by fear. In New York, the infamous fugitive slave laws meant he could be seized and returned to bondage at any time, yet there was also an organized network of abolitionists and free black communities who extended aid. He quickly sent for Anna Murray, and they were married on September 15, 1838, forging a partnership that would be central to his ability to stand on his own and develop his talents. Determined to adopt a name that signaled his new identity and break from the past, Frederick took the surname Douglass, after a character in Sir Walter Scott's poem, The Lady of the Lake. Thus, Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey became Frederick Douglass. The couple soon moved to New Bedford, Massachusetts, a thriving port where whaling and other industries provided opportunities for free black workers. Yet prejudice was still common. When Douglass arrived in New Bedford, he discovered that white ship caulkers, men who worked in the shipyards, often refused to work alongside black men. He had to settle for menial labor, even though he was skilled. But in New Bedford, he also encountered a strong abolitionist community, a well-established free black population, and Quakers, who often opposed slavery on religious grounds. He immersed himself in reading materials, especially The Liberator, an abolitionist newspaper published by William Lloyd Garrison. Douglass became enthralled by Garrison's fiery denunciations of slavery. "My soul was set all on fire," Douglass would say, describing his reaction to Garrison's words. He began attending local anti-slavery meetings, sometimes even quietly participating. His imposing physical presence, tall, muscular, with a bearing that radiated both dignity and intensity, coupled with his newfound confidence, made him stand out. Though initially shy about speaking in public, Douglass found an urgent need to share his testimony about slavery's evils. One day, in 1841, at an abolitionist convention on Nantucket, he was called upon by the organizers to speak. Nervous yet determined, he stepped forward and began to tell his story. The audience was spellbound by his eloquence and the moral clarity of his first-hand account. He recalled, "It was a severe cross, and I took it up reluctantly. The truth was, I felt myself a slave, and the idea of speaking to white people weighed me down." His speech was a revelation, not only to the audience but to Douglass himself. Here was a man who had been enslaved, yet spoke with the clarity and presence of a practiced orator. Garrison was immediately impressed. Seizing upon Douglass's gift, Garrison encouraged him to join the anti-slavery lecture circuit and share his experiences across the North. Douglass agreed. Before long, he was thrust into the public eye, traveling from town to town, telling packed audiences about the horrors of slavery. People who had never met an enslaved person listened in rapt attention to Douglass's vivid depictions of whippings, separations of families, forced ignorance, and the day-to-day indignities. His words carried the force of undisputed truth. Many were moved to tears. Others were shocked into activism. Yet alongside the adulation came doubt. It was difficult for some white audiences to believe that a black man who had been enslaved could speak and write so well. Rumors circulated that he was perhaps an impostor or that his story was embellished for dramatic effect. These suspicions irritated Douglass, and he expressed frustration that his intellect was continually questioned. "They would not believe I was ever a slave," he remarked. To dispel these doubts and to further the cause, Douglass wrote and published his first autobiography in 1845, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. This slender volume was a revelation. Douglass named names, the real individuals who had held him in bondage, the real places where he had labored. The text was searing and poignant, laying bare the mechanics of enslavement in a way few accounts had done before. "I would at times feel that learning to read had been a curse rather than a blessing," he wrote, capturing the anguish of a consciousness awakened to injustice, yet still trapped within its confines. The narrative became a sensation, selling thousands of copies in the United States and abroad. However, its success put Douglass in grave danger. By openly identifying himself as a fugitive, he risked being seized and returned to his so-called owners. Concerned friends in the abolitionist movement urged him to travel to the British Isles, where many prominent abolitionists offered him refuge. In 1845, he sailed to Europe, spending nearly 2 years touring Ireland, England, and Scotland. He was greeted warmly, and audiences flocked to hear the eloquent American speak against slavery. He wrote later of his time in Ireland, "I breathe, and lo, the chattel becomes a man." For perhaps the first time, Douglass found himself treated not as a curiosity, but as a respected gentleman. During his stay, supporters in Britain raised the funds necessary to purchase his legal freedom. Despite the moral ambiguity Douglass felt about the idea of being purchased, the transaction allowed him to return to the United States in 1847 as a free man by law, no longer subject to the Fugitive Slave Acts. Renewed in spirit and with a broader international perspective, Douglass returned home determined to escalate his activism. That same year, he moved to Rochester, New York, and launched his own anti-slavery newspaper, the North Star. The newspaper's motto summarized his convictions. Right is of no sex. Truth is of no color. God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren. The North Star aimed not merely to advocate for the abolition of slavery, but also to champion the rights of women and other marginalized groups. Douglass's moral vision did not separate these causes. He believed firmly in universal human rights, a stance that sometimes set him at odds with other activists who focused solely on slavery's abolition. Financially, running a newspaper was challenging, especially with limited support from advertisers due to Douglass's uncompromising stances. Yet he persisted, fueled by a sense of duty. He later recalled, "I have not allowed myself to be insensible to the isolated position I should occupy and to the numerous and formidable obstacles in my path. But strong in my conviction of right, anxious to do something for my brethren in bonds, and feeling that no one else could do this work as well as I embarked in the undertaking." His relationship with William Lloyd Garrison, once a close mentor, grew strained over time. Garrison believed the U.S. Constitution was a fundamentally pro-slavery document and advocated for disunion from the slave-holding states. Douglass, however, came to view the Constitution as potentially anti-slavery if interpreted according to its higher principles. He gradually adopted the perspective that the Constitution could be wielded as a weapon against slavery from within the system. This ideological rift caused a public falling out between the two men, but Douglass did not relent. His reasoning, articulated in speeches and editorials, hinged on the idea that if the Constitution enshrined certain universal rights, then those rights had to be extended to all, regardless of color. In one of his speeches, he argued, "Interpreted as it ought to be interpreted, the Constitution is a glorious liberty document." This position earned him new allies, particularly among political abolitionists, but also lost him old friends. Throughout the 1850s, Douglass remained in Rochester, making his newspaper a hub of anti-slavery thought. He also became involved in the Underground Railroad, hiding fugitive enslaved people in his home. The demands of moral duty weighed heavily on him. He refused to shy away from radical measures if they furthered freedom. He grew increasingly aware of the sharpening national tensions over slavery, especially as events like the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 and the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 exposed the country's deep divisions. He also met and corresponded with radical abolitionist John Brown, who believed armed insurrection was the only way to overthrow slavery. Though Douglass admired Brown's conviction, he questioned the practicality of a direct, violent assault. He met Brown secretly at a quarry in Chambersburg, Pennsylvania, shortly before Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. Brown tried to persuade Douglass to join, but Douglass declined, sensing it was doomed. After the raid failed, Brown was captured and executed, becoming a martyr to the anti-slavery cause. Douglass, fearing arrest for his connection, fled temporarily to Canada, then to England once again, until the furor subsided. With the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and the subsequent outbreak of the Civil War, Douglass threw his full moral support behind the Union cause, though he initially criticized Lincoln for moving too slowly on emancipation. He who would be free himself must strike the blow, Douglass had long insisted, advocating for the enlistment of black men into the Union Army. It was not enough, he argued, for the war to be a contest over preserving the Union. It had to become a war to end slavery once and for all. In public speeches, he pressed the Negro's right to do something more for the country than dig ditches. He recruited black soldiers, working tirelessly to fill the ranks of regiments such as the 54th Massachusetts, one of the first official black units in the Union Army. His own sons, Lewis and Charles, enlisted. Douglas's fervor came from a belief that military service would not only help crush the Confederacy, but also prove that African Americans were deserving of full citizenship and respect. He was pleased and relieved when Lincoln issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in 1862 and the final version on January 1st, 1863. However, Douglas still pressed for more. He had an opportunity to meet with Lincoln at the White House on multiple occasions, something virtually unheard of for a black man at the time. Douglas later recounted that Lincoln treated him with a surprising measure of respect, listening to his concerns about the pay inequity black soldiers faced, as well as their treatment if captured by Confederate forces. Though Douglas was unsparing in his critiques of Lincoln's early caution, he credited the president for ultimately aligning the Union's war aims with the cause of liberty. In one of his reflections, Douglas said of Lincoln, "He treated me as a man. He did not let me feel for a moment that there was any difference in the color of our skins." As the war drew to a close, and with the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865, which outlawed slavery, Douglas looked to the future. The question now was how to secure true equality and citizenship for the 4 million newly freed African Americans. He pressed for the right to vote, seeing it as essential to any true freedom. "Slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot," Douglas declared, urging Congress to pass legislation that would extend suffrage. The 14th and 15th Amendments, granting citizenship and the vote to black men, represented, in Douglas's view, enormous steps forward, though the struggle for enforcement and acceptance would be an ongoing battle for generations. He championed these amendments in countless speeches, reminding the public that symbolic freedom without the power to shape one's destiny was merely another form of subjugation. After the war, Douglas moved his family to Washington, D.C., where he continued his political activism. He found new roles. He served as president of the Freedmen's Savings Bank, though the bank later failed, tarnishing his tenure, and as U.S. Marshal and then Recorder of Deeds for the District of Columbia. During the 1870s and 1880s, he traveled extensively on the lecture circuit, addressing issues from civil rights to women's suffrage. At the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention, he had already championed women's rights, one of the few men present to do so, contending that the nation could not be free while half its population remained disenfranchised. Though his support for the 15th Amendment caused a brief rift with some women's rights activists who felt betrayed that voting rights were not extended to women simultaneously, Douglas never wavered in his overall commitment to gender equality. He famously stated, "When I ran away from slavery, it was for myself. When I advocated emancipation, it was for my people. But when I stood up for the rights of woman, it was out of the fullness of my heart." His personal life, too, underwent changes. Anna, his wife of many decades and mother to his children, died in 1882. 2 years later, Douglas married Helen Pitts, a white woman nearly 20 years his junior. This marriage caused scandal among many of Douglas's friends and family, including his children, some of whom found it difficult to accept. But Douglas stood firm, stating, "Love came to me, and I was not afraid to marry the woman I loved because of her race." The union proved a testament to Douglas's unwavering belief in the equality of all people, a principle he carried into every aspect of his life. As he aged, Douglas's fame continued to grow, and he was often referred to as the Sage of Anacostia. He purchased Cedar Hill in Washington, a comfortable home that overlooked the city. There, he worked on his final autobiography, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, which was published in various editions and served as a capstone to his earlier works. In that volume, he reflected on the sweeping changes he had witnessed, from a boy born into bondage to a statesman conversing with presidents. Yet, he recognized that much remained to be done. Lynching, black disenfranchisement, and Jim Crow laws were already casting a long shadow over the post-Reconstruction South. Douglass did not limit himself to domestic issues. He also served briefly as U.S. Minister Resident and Consul General to Haiti in 1889, striving to represent American interests while also championing respect for Haiti, the first black republic born from a successful slave revolt. The position proved fraught with diplomatic complexities, and Douglass faced difficulties with both Haitian authorities and the American government. Though his tenure ended in frustration, it signaled his ongoing desire to see people of African descent across the Western Hemisphere recognized and respected. His voice never lost its urgency. In one of his later speeches, West India Emancipation, delivered in 1894, he reminded his audience that where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any one class is made to feel that society is an organized conspiracy to oppress, rob, and degrade them, neither persons nor property will be safe. It was a clarion call that resonated well beyond its time, illuminating the need for constant vigilance in the pursuit of a just society. On February 20th, 1895, after attending a meeting of the National Council of Women in Washington, Douglass returned home. He spoke with Helen about the uplifting experience, feeling energized and excited about the day's events. Moments later, he collapsed in his hallway and died from a massive heart attack. He was around 77 years old, a remarkable lifespan for someone who had experienced the rigors of slavery and a life of constant public demands. The shock of his passing was felt throughout the country. Eulogies poured in from statesmen, activists, and ordinary citizens. The man who had once been forbidden to learn his letters had, by his death, become one of the most celebrated orators of the age. Frederick Douglass's life story is one of transformation, but it is also a chronicle of America's transformation. Born under a system that legally defined him as property, he rose to become an advisor to presidents and a global advocate for human rights. The power of his words, both spoken and written, was rooted in their unwavering honesty. He did not shrink from exposing the hypocrisy of a nation that proclaimed liberty as its birthright while denying that liberty to millions. At the same time, he championed the lofty ideals of the nation's founding documents, insisting that these principles must be extended to every citizen, regardless of color or gender. The life of the nation is secure only while the nation is honest, truthful, and virtuous, he asserted, calling each generation to renew that commitment. The magnitude of his influence can be traced in part to his autobiographies. First, the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave, 1845, which laid bare the raw brutality and moral corruption of slavery. Then, My Bondage and My Freedom, 1855, which expanded on his personal philosophy and experiences. And finally, Life and Times of Frederick Douglass, 1881, revised 1892, which chronicled his post-war activism and reflections on the Reconstruction era. In each, Douglass interspersed personal memories with broader social and political insights. He revealed that the fight against slavery was not merely about one man's flight from bondage, but a universal crusade for human dignity. Throughout his life, Douglass kept certain themes in focus. Chief among them was the value of literacy and education, which he credited as the first essential step on the path to freedom. Another was moral suasion, the belief that reasoned argument grounded in ethical principles could shift public opinion. Yet he was never naive about the intransigence of power structures. As he once famously stated, Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. This line epitomizes his recognition that moral argument, while crucial, must be coupled with political pressure, legal strategy, and, if necessary, militant resistance. In recounting his own journey, Douglass repeatedly emphasized moments of self-discovery. One such moment was his fight with Covey, after which he realized the power of defiance. Another was the searing reprimand Hugh Old delivered to Sophia about the dangers of teaching an enslaved child to read, which illuminated the path from bondage to freedom. A later one was his triumph as a public speaker at Nantucket, where he found that words could dissolve prejudice and stir collective action. Each of these turning points shaped the man he became, a figure of unwavering conviction, tireless in exposing hypocrisy, and expansive in his empathy for all oppressed people. When we seek to understand Douglass, we can look to the eloquence of his speeches. In his address commemorating the 4th of July, he famously asked, "What, to the American slave, is your 4th of July?" That speech, delivered in 1852, was a piercing indictment of the nation's contradictions. Standing before an audience celebrating the anniversary of American liberty, Douglass spoke candidly of the immeasurable distance between the ideals inscribed in the Declaration of Independence and the daily reality lived by enslaved people. He refused to flatter his audience with complacent words. Instead, he demanded they confront the glaring disparity that made the holiday a sham for millions. And yet he also ended that speech on a note of hope, asserting that the principles of the founders, if truly upheld, would one day overthrow the slave system. Douglass's rhetorical gifts extended beyond condemnation to inspiration. His words often carried a lyrical quality, inviting listeners not just to see the injustice, but to feel it as a moral wound. He invoked the Bible, the Constitution, and the moral traditions of Western political thought, weaving them together to emphasize that slavery was a betrayal of the nation's core values. "I would unite with anybody to do right," he once declared, "and with nobody to do wrong." That statement reflected his openness to alliances outside narrow party lines or sectarian divides, a pragmatism that led him to work with people of varied ideologies and backgrounds, provided they were committed to ending slavery. Over time, Douglass became a living symbol of emancipation's promise and its challenges. Even after the Civil War and the Reconstruction Amendments, he warned that legal changes must be buttressed by an overhaul of social attitudes. In the face of rising segregation and racial violence, he continued to lecture and write, hammering home the point that freedom was not a static achievement, but a continuous struggle. The egalitarian future he envisioned, one of racial justice, women's rights, and international comity, remained by and large unrealized during his lifetime, but he never ceased pushing for it. "If there is no struggle, there is no progress," he famously said, highlighting the need for persistent effort in the face of entrenched discrimination. One of the most moving aspects of Douglass's life is the array of personal sacrifices he and his family made. Anna's support and quiet labor undergirded much of Douglass's public endeavors, even as she battled the uncertainties of being married to a man whose activism put him constantly in danger. Their children lived with the knowledge that their father was a public figure, targeted by hostile mobs and slave catchers. Douglass's home in Rochester was burned under suspicious circumstances in 1872, destroying many of his papers and personal documents, a fact he lamented deeply. Such losses were a constant reminder of how precarious his position remained even after he was lionized as a major moral voice. And yet, for all the hardships, Douglass remained steadfastly optimistic about the power of change. In one address, he declared, "The whole history of the progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made to her august claims have been born of earnest struggle. From his perspective, the arc of moral progress, while not guaranteed, could bend toward justice when propelled by courage and unity. This faith in the possibility of progress was perhaps his greatest contribution, instilling hope in countless others who fought for abolition and later for civil rights. When Douglass passed away in 1895, his funeral drew mourners from across the country. At his home in Cedar Hill, people from all walks of life paid their respects. He was buried in Mount Hope Cemetery in Rochester, near the place where he had first established himself as a free man of letters and journalism. In a fitting tribute, members of the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, one of the first black military units he had helped organize, served as an honor guard. The newspapers eulogized him as one of the greatest Americans of his era, a testament to the astonishing journey from enslaved child to national statesman. His legacy persisted through the decades that followed. Early civil rights activists, from Ida B. Wells to Webb Du Bois, drew on Douglass's writings an example, citing him as a pioneer who proved the power of an informed black conscience in shaping public opinion. Du Bois, for instance, revered Douglass for his intellectual might and moral clarity. The NAACP, formed in 1909, embraced Douglass as an iconic forerunner in its mission to secure equal rights. In time, Douglass's writings found their way into school curricula, recognized for their literary merit as well as their historical significance. Yet it was not simply Douglass's intellect or rhetorical flourishes that immortalized him. It was the sheer force of his humanity, forged in adversity and polished by an unwavering belief that people, at their best, could transcend the barbarities of their time. He had endured the lash, the hunger, the demeaning tyranny of slaveholders who tried to reduce him to an object. He had fought back, literally and figuratively, using both fists and pen to assert his rightful place in the world. His entire life stands as a rebuke to those who claimed that African Americans were inherently inferior or incapable of self-improvement. His achievements shattered that racist fiction, proving instead that the constraints of slavery were precisely that, constraints imposed by an unjust system, not reflections of innate capacity. Douglass's own words resonate across the years. I prefer to be true to myself, even at the hazard of incurring the ridicule of others, rather than to be false and incur my own abhorrence. That fidelity to one's moral compass, no matter the personal cost, animates his story from beginning to end. Whether facing the menacing gaze of overseers, the doubts of skeptical audiences, or the complexities of post-war politics, he refused to compromise on the fundamental principle that all people deserve freedom and equality. Over time, he refined his strategies, from moral suasion to political engagement, yet his core commitment never wavered. If one listens closely, one can almost hear Douglass's voice echoing whenever the nation grapples with questions of justice and equality. He taught that freedom is not bestowed by benevolent rulers, but secured through a combination of self-assertion and cooperative effort. He showed that the pen could be as mighty as the sword in undermining a system built on falsehoods. He demonstrated that personal advancement and communal uplift need not be separate aims. His own escape to freedom became the platform from which he championed the freedom of millions more. In the aftermath of the Civil War, as Reconstruction gave way to the darker era of Jim Crow, Douglass's cautionary words found renewed relevance. Where justice is denied, neither persons nor property will be safe. He understood that the end of legal slavery was only the first chapter in a long narrative of securing true equality. His activism for women's rights similarly anticipated later struggles for gender equality. His emphasis on the Constitution as a living document capable of delivering on the promise of liberty foreshadowed the battles waged in the courts throughout the 20th century. And yet, for all his foresight, Douglass remained a man of his time, shaped by the constraints and opportunities of the mid-19th century. He sometimes wrestled with how best to ally with white reformers without diluting the autonomy of black voices. He debated with other black leaders about the best way to tackle prejudice, occasionally clashing with those who saw an immediate solution in separatism or colonization. Douglass consistently argued that African Americans had earned the right to claim the United States as their homeland, having contributed their toil and their blood to its development. He believed it was not departure that was needed, but rather a radical redefinition of citizenship and national identity, one that embraced everyone. When Douglass revised his autobiographical writings, he reflected on the distance he had traveled, recognizing that many of his early dreams had come to fruition, yet many others remained deferred. But he never abandoned the optimism that had always propelled him forward. Near the end of his life and times, he said, "One cannot wonder that I have passed a somewhat eventful life." Indeed, from a child taught to view himself as property, to a statesman hobnobbing with the political elite, his life was more than eventful. It was revolutionary. Those who seek to understand the marrow of Frederick Douglass's life need only explore how he discovered the power of words, the necessity of action, and the moral imperative to claim one's humanity against all odds. His mother's faint image, his stolen childhood, the lashings of Covey, the intangible but ever-present threat of being sold away, these were the forging fires of a spirit that refused to be broken. The subsequent expansions of his mind through literacy, the daring escape to freedom, the stirring orations in churches and halls across the North, these were the stepping stones that turned him into one of the 19th century's most recognized and respected voices. He was fond of quoting poetry and scripture, imbuing his speeches with a broad cultural resonance. Through these allusions, he connected with audiences that might otherwise have dismissed him. He pointed to universal truths, that oppression anywhere undermines freedom everywhere, that moral suasion is a potent force but must be joined by political agency, and that learning is a lifelong pursuit integral to self-liberation. He elevated the humble act of reading to the level of a holy rite, something so powerful that enslavers sought to ban it. No one who heard Douglass speak or read his autobiographies could remain untouched by the sincerity and clarity of his convictions. Even in death, Douglass's influence endured, spanning movements that went far beyond abolition. Suffragists called upon his memory to support the cause of women's enfranchisement. Labor activists cited him in their battles against exploitation, and civil rights leaders invoked his name as they challenged segregation. Like a beacon, his writings continued to illuminate the path toward liberty and justice. Throughout the 20th century, when African Americans faced Jim Crow, lynching, and systemic discrimination, Douglass was revered as a foundational ancestor whose struggles and triumphs prefigured their own. In the 21st century, he remains an essential figure whose words still ring with startling relevance. What was it about Douglass that made him so enduring? Part of the answer lies in his embracing of the American ideal, not as it was, but as it could be. He critiqued the nation's hypocrisy, exposing its ugliest contradictions. Yet he also laid claim to its founding documents, insisting that if they genuinely meant all men are created equal, then that promise must extend to him, to his children, and to all who toiled in the fields, factories, or anywhere else. His brand of patriotism was not blind loyalty. It was a demand that the nation live up to its professed standards. "I know of no rights of race superior to the rights of humanity," he said. underscoring his belief that one's ultimate allegiance should be to the broader family of humankind. In telling Frederick Douglass's story, one cannot ignore the profound tragedy of slavery and its lingering echoes. Yet his life also stands as a shining testament to resilience. He took the raw materials of suffering and transformed them into a weaponized intellect, a moral force that rattled the foundations of the slave-holding republic. He possessed an uncanny ability to connect personal narrative with universal principle, reminding listeners that his story was not just his own, but that of millions. "I appear before you this evening as a thief and a robber," he once said at an anti-slavery meeting, explaining, "I stole this head, these limbs, this body from my master, and ran off with them." That wry admission struck home, demonstrating the absurdity of a system that claimed ownership over a man's very being. He remained aware of the spiritual dimension of his struggle, invoking a deep-seated sense of justice rooted in Christian teachings, while simultaneously condemning the Christianity of this land that condoned slavery. His distinctions between the Christianity of Christ and the hypocritical version practiced by slaveholders underscored his insistence that faith must be measured by deeds, not mere professions. This moral clarity alienated some Christians, but emboldened many others who recognized the chasm between genuine religious principles and a perverse theology that justified human bondage. As the decades rolled on, Douglass's birthdays were often marked by tributes, both formal and informal, celebrating his life and achievements. He himself used these occasions to reflect on the progress made and the challenges ahead. His speeches in the later part of his life grew more reflective, but never fatalistic. He spoke often of the need for continued vigilance, anticipating the ways in which the legacy of slavery would morph into new forms of oppression. While he could not have foreseen the exact shape of Jim Crow laws or the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century, his words served as a foundation for those future activists who carried the torch of equality forward. In the final analysis, Frederick Douglass's life can be seen as a grand testament to the capacity of an individual to reshape his destiny and, in doing so, alter the moral landscape of an entire nation. He took the raw brutality of slavery, a system designed to dehumanize him, and turned it into a moral vantage point from which he called the nation to account. He harnessed literacy, self-discipline, and unbreakable resolve to become a figure who could not be ignored. He challenged the comfortable illusions of his era, exposing the myth of black inferiority, the hypocrisy of American liberty, and the unwillingness of many reformers to see the struggle through to its logical end. Douglass's story weaves together themes of identity, courage, and hope. His life was never static. Each time he reached a new plateau, he sought higher ground. His early triumph, learning to read, led him to a consciousness that demanded freedom. His successful escape from slavery led him to a podium that called for the liberation of others. His journey to the British Isles, where he tasted unencumbered respect, deepened his conviction that America could and must do better. His break with Garrison spurred him to develop his own nuanced political philosophy. His frustration with Lincoln's initial caution turned to respect once the president aligned himself with emancipation. And even after slavery was abolished, Douglass fought for the civil and political rights of all. The inevitability of conflict never dissuaded him. He recognized that profound change often requires disruption and sacrifice, whether in the form of war, mass protest, or relentless public agitation. Nevertheless, he believed in the moral universe and that its arc could bend toward justice, so long as men and women of conscience did the bending. His own activism was an embodiment of that principle. In speaking of his own journey, Douglass repeatedly returned to that seminal moment of defiance against Covey, when he discovered he had the power to resist brutality. We might see that as a metaphor for his life and legacy, reminding us that the moment one stands up against oppression, even if one stands alone, marks the juncture where subjugation yields to dignity. For Douglass, that moment was not a solitary victory, but the beginning of a broader commitment to free not only himself, but all those who remained in chains. Thus, the story of Frederick Douglass, told here in the cadence of biography and laced with his own words, stands as a triumphant narrative that lifts us beyond the boundaries of its era. Douglass lived a dramatic, multifaceted life, from the uncertain child on a Maryland plantation to the visionary statesman guiding a nation's conscience. His example endures because it crystallizes an essential truth: that no system of oppression can withstand the luminous power of self-determination, truth-telling, and collective moral purpose. In Douglass, we find the blueprint of how one person's refusal to accept the world as it is can usher forth a new understanding of what the world should be. He reminds us that the victory over slavery was not the end of the struggle for justice, but merely the starting point for all the battles yet to come. On the day he died, Frederick Douglass had just returned from a meeting that underlined his lifelong support for women's rights. It was a fitting testament to his belief in universal equality. Even at the dusk of his years, his spirit remained unquenched, a burning flame urging humanity forward. The resonance of his voice across time is a reminder that the words and deeds of one individual can echo through history, challenging each subsequent generation to look in the mirror and ask, how well have we honored the ideals of freedom and equality we profess to cherish? He once wrote, "The soul that is within me, no man can degrade." In that single sentence lies the unbreakable steel of his character, a testament to the fact that true freedom begins in the mind and heart. Frederick Douglass unlocked that freedom for himself by learning to read, by daring to dream, by never relinquishing his dignity, even when the world told him he had none. And in so doing, he gifted that vision to countless others, urging them to claim their own inalienable rights, to speak their own truths, and to stand firm in the face of any tyranny that dares to question their humanity.